Well, thank you, Mr. President, and thanks to my colleague from Kansas here. Look, this is pretty simple, and it's pretty obvious. The United States Senate would pass aid, much-needed aid to Israel today, at this very moment. Aid the House has already passed. It could go to the president's signature this afternoon if my Democratic colleagues would stand down, but they won't. Many of them here are gathered to push back against our very common-sense proposal to offer support to one of our most important allies as they face an existential threat. And it's important for us to be honest about that fact, to acknowledge that Israel would be getting support from this government tomorrow if our Democratic friends didn't stop it today. Now, why are they doing this? You will hear over the next hour or so, we'll hear a lot of slogans, but very little real discussion about our policy in Ukraine or our policy in Israel. The Democrats have decided that this must be combined into a massive hodgepodge package for it to pass the United States Senate. They're doing this because they know that America is united behind Israel, and they want to use our Israeli allies as a political cover in their time of crisis. That is all this is about. You'll hear a whole lot, but that is ultimately what this is about. They know they cannot defend President Biden's disastrous, pointless, and ultimately directionless Ukraine policy, so they'd like to use Israel as a cover. Now, we have before us a hodgepodge of a supplemental from the President of the United States. It combines a few $1 billion for Ukraine with a few $1 billion to Gazan support, because that makes a ton of sense, right? Let's give money to the Israelis to fight back against Hamas, and then let's give some money to Hamas too. I'm sure they won't use it to kill Israelis. It'll just be food and medicine, we're assured, even though we know that because Hamas is the functional government in Gaza, we know if we give them support, that support will ultimately flow to their war effort. At least some of it will. Let's be honest about it. Maybe some of it will flow to the Palestinian people. Call me skeptical, but we know that at least some of it will support the Hamas war effort. Let's be honest about that fact. It's not just that, though. It's not just a few billion for Hamas, a few billion for Israel. It's a few billion to resettle migrants in the United States of America, because God knows we haven't had enough resettlement of migrants in the United States of America over the last couple of years. The fentanyl deaths and the chaos and crime in our country prove it. And then on top of that, let's add $60 billion to Ukraine, because of course we know that Israel and Ukraine are very closely connected. They're so closely connected, in fact, that this chamber can't have a separate debate on one aid package or the other. And then let's add some money to East Asia on top of that. We'll combine all this into a $106 billion supplemental aid package that has very, very little. The gross majority of the money has nothing to do with Israel, and we will do it so that we can cover for the fact that the President of the United States has thrown the world into chaos. What I'd like to do is have a separate debate. Divide these questions into separate conversations and debate them separately. And oh, by the way, use the political will of this chamber to support our Israeli allies yesterday, because they've needed it for much longer than that. Now, let me close with just a couple of final observations here, and then I'll kick it over to my friend, the senator from Missouri. I'm getting sick in this Ukraine policy debate of hearing the same exact slogans repeated. This country has been governed for 30 years on bipartisan foreign policy slogans. Why don't we have a real debate? We are told again and again and again that Vladimir Putin is just like Hitler in the 1930s. If we don't stop him in Ukraine, he's going to march all the way through Europe. What happened to our education system that the only historical analogy we can use in this chamber is World War II? What about World War I, where competing major powers threw the entire world into conflict because we didn't make smart decisions, we didn't de-escalate conflict when we had the opportunity? Why is it that we think Vladimir Putin, who has struggled to fight against the Ukrainians, is somehow going to be able to march all the way to Berlin when he can't conquer a country immediately to his east? Why do we think that everything that happens in the United States and in the world in 2023 is Munich almost a century ago? I am sick of us not having a real debate on this conversation. Vladimir Putin is a bad guy. He should not have invaded Ukraine, but our policy in 2023 has to be different than our policy in the 1940s because the circumstances are different. As Lincoln said, our case is anew, so we must think anew and act anew. You'll also hear that China will be emboldened. China will be terribly emboldened if we don't stop the Russians in Ukraine. Well, call me crazy, but I think the Chinese will be emboldened if we use limited American weapons and give it all to the Ukrainians instead of giving it to the Taiwanese. Now, maybe you disagree, but let's have the debate. And let's have the real debate on the president's Ukraine policy instead of holding Israel hostage. There is nothing more shameful than taking an existential crisis, thousands of dead Israeli civilians, and using them as a fig leaf for a Ukraine policy. If you want to defend the Ukraine policy, defend it. Let the Israel aid flow through, and let's let it flow through today. I yield to my good friend from Missouri.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand in solidarity with my colleagues on separating these issues. I think the American people think that's what we do here. I think the American people think we actually have an appropriations process where we have individual bills come forth and we're offering amendments, and senators can have their say. Republicans and Democrats can have different ideas, offer different amendments, and we vote on those things. That's actually not what happens here at all. And this is now compounding this with this supplemental aid package of putting on a bunch of unrelated issues to try to bootstrap Ukraine aid when the most pressing need we have right now, the most bipartisan support we have right now, is the Israeli aid. And by the way, it's paid for. Now, I know listening to the hallways buzz in this town about actually paying for something is like unbelievable. Like, it's going to be catastrophic if we actually have that discussion. But I think it's healthy. But I think we need to separate these issues. This is supposed to be the most deliberative body in the history of the world. And what we're told is we can't do that. And to this, my friend from Ohio's point, history doesn't begin and end with Neville Chamberlain. There are a lot of lessons from history about how do you confront these things. And by the way, each theater is very different. What Israel needs is different. What Ukraine might need is different. What Taiwan might need is different. Oh, and by the way, what the United States of America might need is different as we face our chief rival in the world. We've never had one like this in the history of this country with China. We've never had an economic rival, a nuclear power, and a militarized rival like we have with China. Maybe we should be talking, as we talk about this military-industrial base, and I think there's broad support for this, for long-range capability. Our military-industrial base is strapped right now. We're at capacity. We ought to be growing that. I support that, but I think we ought to have a discussion about what does the United States need too. But as it relates to Israel, they have a clear objective, a likelihood of success, broad support. I have yet to hear any of that as it relates to Ukraine. All we get are, again, slogans and fear-mongering. I think, by the way, if you brought up that for an individual vote, it might pass. I don't know. We ought to try it, but I know this would. It should today. But we're going to hear objections now from the Democrats. They're going to object to this and forestall this important aid that our allies in Israel, who are facing a real existential threat right now, need. Again, and by the way, we've thrown in, border here, and call me skeptical as it relates to Joe Biden and his administration on his seriousness when it comes to the border. When I was Attorney General in Missouri, we fought some of these fights in court, including keeping Remain in Mexico in place. We had to get court orders and contempt orders against this administration to actually follow the judge's order to enforce the law. Now, I am going to support the strongest border package possible, but it's really hard when you have an executive branch that isn't interested in executing the law. And now we have 8+ million people in this country who've come here illegally. They've admitted that quite possibly we have terrorists in this country because we have an open border. Let's have that debate also. But here we are with an opportunity to separate the Israeli funding, again, that has broad support. Each one of these issues, each one of these funding requests have separate realities on the ground, political support, strategies, likelihood of success. Let's respect that, and let's respect the will of the American people that we can actually come up here and do the important work we were sent here to do. which is to have real debate in what's supposed to be the most deliberative body in the history of the world. I yield back to the senator from Kansas.